If you've ever played the original Legend of Zelda, you know how easy it is to get lost. So without a clue of where to go, that players back in the day would resort to creating their own maps, or nowadays, just following a walkthrough online. While I'm sure some people still like that kind of challenge in games, most would prefer to be able to make significant progress in a game during their play sessions. As the medium of video games has expanded and evolved, so have the ways there are to lead a player through an environment. While you can outright tell a player with words or objective markers on a map, doing so can take the fun out of the experience. Instead, games will opt to be an invisible guide, telling the player where to go in a manner much more subtle. I'm Anthony Thompson, and this is how to invisibly lead a player through an environment. There are many methods and techniques of invisibly guiding a player, but I believe I've managed to split them into two main categories, starting with contrast in the environment. As the name implies, this is ways to gain the player's attention using contrasting elements. Contrasts are much more effective in using comparative elements because naturally things that contrast stand out much more. As with the original Zelda, there are certain bushes that can be burned down to progress and unlock secrets. The thing is, every single bush looks the exact same. There's nothing that tells the player which bush can be burned, not even a dialogue hint. But thankfully, we are no longer in the Stone Age of games, and developers have the generosity to be less cryptic with their puzzles. With the game made today, the bush could have specific berries, the color of the berries could stand out among the environment, and other ways to contrast one bush from another. Let's start with the most overt of the methods, movement and sounds. Taking advantage of the human sense of sight and hearing, it's quite self-explanatory that it can be used to guide a player. While most of the games in this video will be ones with intended paths and stories to follow, movement and sounds are the methods that apply especially well to more non-linear or multiplayer games, like first-person shooters, where you hear gunfire with 3D audio, alerting the player to the direction of danger, or racing games with animated directional lines that signify which direction to turn. Though this is not to say that they can't be used in linear games, because they are. As an example of a linear game using both simultaneously is this moment in The Last of Us, where within the player's sight you see a car come crashing into a gas station, creating a loud and roaring oil fire, telling the player that this is definitely not the direction to go in. Probably the most used and literally biggest feature to add a contrasting element is a focal point, usually some kind of large structure to draw the eye towards a certain location. As seen in open world games like Breath of the Wild and Assassin's Creed, the landscapes generally flow in a linear fashion. However, there are large structures that serve as environmental signposts. The Seeker Towers in Breath of the Wild and vantage points in Assassin's Creed have a dual purpose for guidance, as they can be seen from almost any angle, and once the player scales them, they can be used as a lookout for the player to mark their next destination. The idea of large structures able to be seen from various angles is a technique that comes from theme park design called weening, or the structures themselves called weenies. Visitors would see the structure break into the horizon, and on their way towards it, they strategically have spots where the structure can be seen, reminding them of their destination. It's fitting that games would try to be like a theme park. In the case of Breath of the Wild, the towers are inorganic and technological in appearance, using the concept of shape language to further contrast its focal point among the environment. Another game that does this is Journey, where huge inorganic towers stand out from their desert surroundings. While these are just a couple of examples, I'm sure you can look at any game and be able to pick out the large structures that catch your eye. Similarly, breadcrumbing tends to use pickups to grab a player's attention, in hopes to lead the player towards the main objective or optional secrets, as seen in platformers like Donkey Kong and Metroid. This method can make finding a secret feel like a surprise, rewarding the player for wanting to collect every pickup. Two approaches that can provide the most contrast are color and lighting. In Kena Bridge of Spirits, the game starts in an almost fully dark area. After using the pulse mechanic, blue flames and crystals come to life, pointing the way forward. Here the game is using contrasting lights in a dark environment, and contrasting color with blue against more naturalistic colors like green, brown, and gray. After walking up these stairs towards the bright shiny light of day from outside, you find yourself in a lush forest. Even here, contrasting lighting is used, with lanterns along the path and sunlight peering through the trees. It also just so happens that there are interactable bushes with berries that stand out from the environment, as I mentioned earlier. What a coincidence. After some time, the game introduces climbing, which marks climbable ledges with a sort of white wear and tear, white being a bright tone that pops out of the background. Games that also do this are the Uncharted and new Tomb Raiders, using patterns and colors on climbable ledges and walls, all while maintaining the realistic setting and graphics. Jedi Fallen Order marks walls that can be used to wall run with a pattern that runs horizontally parallel, looking more uniform than regular walls and making sure players don't try to wall run anywhere else and risk falling. Keeping with games where players run and jump, another prominent example is Mirror's Edge. Runner's Vision highlights the objects players can use to keep moving, all while stylishly imbuing a vibrant red upon the white city of glass. In fast-paced games such as this, where players are constantly making split-second decisions on the fly, Runner's Vision is an important and helpful feature. However, the game is completely playable and, in my opinion, more fun with Runner's Vision turned off, for reasons that we'll look at in the next section. The second group of methods is using the environment and camera angles to highlight something else. This group is all about composition. Some of the techniques are the ones artists or filmmakers will use to make it so the viewer is looking in the right area. Following up on Mirror's Edge, the reason the game can be played without Runner's Vision is due to how the game frames the path ahead. The way forward is always in frame, avoiding the issue of entering a new area and not knowing where to go because the path was behind the player, for example, although there are times that this is the case. But overall, the game does a good job at keeping a flow state of fast-paced movement. Coming back to the same Last of Us example, because the player is already moving and looking in that direction, it's easy for the devs to put all the action in the middle of the screen and fill up the whole frame. Though the concept is used the opposite way, by framing the way not to go. Two similar methods are leading lines and pincing. It's when the area you want the player to look at is pointed towards with invisible lines created from the surrounding environment. This can be done with the use of perspective and force shortening, careful placement of objects and terrain, or both. The starting area in Shadow of the Colossus has terrain all pointed in forward leading lines towards the gap of the mountain, and the direction is forward due to the framing of the camera after leaving the temple. Pincing can also be used in very linear areas as a way to funnel a player along. This is used very effectively in games where players are moving in narrow hallways. A horror game like Dead Space can use this to their advantage. This scenario in particular shows where the player needs to quickly escape. The funneling hallway structure helps keep the player moving and attention high, while also making it easy for the developers to frame all the action within the player's view. The last method is elevation, where you can create your landscapes with verticality in mind, having the objective be at the highest point. Like this part in Kina, where the player's objective is far and high on top of a mountain, and this tells the player that as long as they are finding paths that ultimately lead upward, they will be going in the right direction. This section in Uncharted 2, where your path is blocked in all directions, forcing the player to look upward, which is the right way to go. The difference between these examples is that one is focused on explicitly showing the objective for the player, and the other is forcing the player to find that elevated path on their own. So there we go, leading the player through an environment from two main categories. It all becomes easier to consider these concepts or even think of your own when you remember the simple idea of show, don't tell. We want the player to feel in charge of their experience and not like they are being dragged along by the developer, even if, in truth, they are. Thanks for watching.